morning to all attendees, participants in this capacity building program, which ISID is arranging. I, as Dr. Rama spoke, come from an NGO. We do research, but our research is more here and now. It's motivated from immediate, more or less immediate, or often short-term policy requirements. But in this area, at least of digital society and digital economy, this has meant that we actually have gone even further, deeper structural than traditional academic researches, as you will find out as I go on. Because digital economy, digital society area moves so fast that often the traditional disciplinary systems, academic systems, and I'm not criticizing them, I'm just stating a fact, are not adequately equipped to deal with both, one, the speed of the changes, and two, the spread of the changes across sectors, across disciplines, typically which are organized and let me say that in an industrial society fashion. So I would today be touching many areas about which you have had lectures before, and Dr. Rama was briefing me, things like industrial policy. What does a digital industrial policy mean? Political economy, which will be central to my presentation today. Our organization comes from a very pronounced political economy, pro-Southern perspective. And then talk about issues like trade, labor, etc. And I understand many of you are from economics background. So, excuse me, it's an hour and a half lecture. Digital economy is too broad. I'd be talking about things which may suddenly appear too new to you. And therefore, I'll be jumping from many things to other things, trying to give you a broader picture. And I'm happy if at some point people want to come in and say, I would like a better clarity on this particular aspect, and I can go in that direction. Towards the midpoint, perhaps I would take a few questions which will give me a temperature of the room and try to then steer my lecture towards the direction of what I understand people here would like to hear more about. I already said that probably the academics is organized around industrial economy and industrial society notions. And this is a very big claim to make, and I'll substantiate it presently. When we hear digital, we take it to be a set of new things which kind of improve almost everything what we do, whether it's transportation, industry, our personal life, education, etc. So it kind of enhances what we already do in some sometimes very far-reaching manner. And that's how, we take an add-on view of digital. There are structures already, and digital comes on and improves them in many different ways. We do not typically seem to take it as a structural change. I mean, no, this notion is very commonly used, perhaps too often, but I really mean here real structural change, and I'll describe you what that is. So present frameworks of digital economy, and therefore also the policy prescription, are just taking digital as an add-on to the industrial society structures. And in addition to that, they deal with crises as they evolve. Like just before I came here, while I was talking to Dr. Rama, and I just saw some news for the day snippets, and Australia today passed a law about how revenues will be distributed between content providers and platforms. So, and I think that's inadequate. The principle behind that law is good, but what has been done is very inadequate. It's trying to patch up a problem. So, and I take that example just to say that policies increasingly or have been in this area there is a problem here, somehow patch that problem. And you as researchers, social scientists know that if problems are of structural nature, patchworks don't work, because soon you plug a leaking pipe, it will leak at another place, because The problem is in the structure of how those pipes are or what's flowing inside those pipes. And therefore, we have to revisit the structures. So I would be mostly revisiting those structures. From a very high level point, but keeping on touching to very specifics. And as an NGO, I am much more interested in here and now of how it affects our lives. But to understand that, we need to go to a 36,000 feet view, go back to understanding structures. And the structures, by structures, I mean here really deep structures. I mean here as deep structure, cultural and social aspects also, but even sector-wise, where does the boundary between a state and the market systems go in a digital context? How the sectors, as we know or understand traditionally, education sector, health sector, transport sector, agriculture sector, manufacturing sector, they themselves change and become a kind of amoebic system under the impact of the digital. So I'm talking about structural changes at that deeper level. So let me go back, and I'll just in the first 10 minutes give a historical view of digital technologies and policy changes around them, including at the global level, because much of digital is global. Unlike in other areas, we have national systems and then they join up at the global level, but digital somehow is kind of congenitally global. Those frameworks, thinkings, policies are not made at a global level, but policy frameworks and thinking is made at a global level. So I will try to look at how technologies have evolved and how policy has tried to keep pace and what has been missing. So if we look at digital, what is digital has changed very quickly over just last 25 years or even less. There was the first phase in which software was digital. I mean, if we look till around 2000, before that, a few years after that, when we talk digital, we talked IT, we talked software, we talked Microsoft, we talked laptops, we talk about Microsoft Office, Excel sheets, we talk about organizations taking on computers, putting their work processes on computers. So it's about softwares. And that continued till around 2005. So let's take a period of like 1995 to 2005 as a period of software as being digital. India at that time had this, you guys, if you remember, it was that 2000, the millennium bug, in which Y2K thing, in which a lot of people thought that the clocks will change to a new millennium and the software systems will collapse because all of them are dated in a certain manner and so on. And a lot of Indian industry responded to the Y2K phenomenon, but also otherwise around that time, Indian IT sector became big. And that was for us the digital thing. And of course, in our own works, we were started to use computers. In your academic work, you were using not laptops, maybe still, but desktops. And that's the policy framework was around the software industry. I'll come back to certain elements of that. We can discuss them at length, but I think they are generally well recognized. India supported Indian software industry. There were the software parks policies. There were all kinds of incentives, subsidies, etc. given, and we did well on the software front. And we became so-called back office software power, if not a software power. From 2005 to around 2005 also marked, by the way, globally with what is the main global policy event in this area, the World Summit on Information Society, which was happened in 2003 and 2005. Around that time, ICT for development was also a very big thing. UNDP, actually, this also came from G8 meetings, which is very funny. The development paradigm came from G8 meetings. Around 2000, there was this Osaka summit and so on. I'm just quickly touching upon some of these points. I will share papers with you which carry that history, but it's important to get a larger view. So ICT for development was considered a completely new notion of development, which will transform the way development is looked. It focused on community development, telecenters, you would have heard those kind of things. as a new way of delivering development. We should transform the traditional ways of development. And here, what was very important, that private sector was considered to be what will drive everything. There was a very early policy document from the US, Framework for Global Electronic E-commerce, which set up the first policy framework around digital or internet, which said that private sector will lead in this area and government would take a backseat. This somehow by default became the way we think about digital technologies. Now, it can be said that were the internet was born in, say, France or the Norwegian countries, we may have had come with a different political and political economy thinking around internet, but fortunately or not fortunately, it was born during Clinton neoliberal times in the US, and therefore it got embedded into it a certain kind of free market thinking. Now, it's also true that much of the early software progress was made because of a certain entrepreneurial energy, which is very unique to the US, where failure is considered to be okay. There is venture capital and all those requirements, and a huge amount of public sector research capacity, which was very basic to whether it's internet or most of the software development also. So there were these confluence of factors which made US as the place where digital technologies were born, internet was born, and later technologies, AI, etc., also flourished. And in that flourishing, a certain kind of political economy thinking and policy thinking has come around with it. It has been very difficult to push back as things change, as I'll come to very soon. Anyway, so the World Summit on Information Society generally was supported by the US initially because the effort here was to push ICT for development. And through that ICT for development, the US also wanted to push its brand of neoliberal development. And for them, it was a very convenient match because ICTs had this power which nobody wanted to resist. There were fascinating things which ICTs would deliver almost by the year, if not by the month. And on the top of it was riding a neoliberal model of development. And so it became central to Northern view of looking at development. And they changed UNDP also to that effect. And UNDP for the first time said that development models should have private sector at the center and so on. Those kind of things happen. However, by the end of World Summit on Information Society, there started to be a huge amount of geopolitics of who controls the internet. And that's where politics got introduced. And by the end of World Summit, US would have preferred that there would have not been that World Summit, because what they thought was a way to push their neoliberal development model across the world in a very shiny, beautiful, acceptable manner, riding over the ICTs, had become a geopolitical contestation. And people were asking the question that the US controls the internet too much. And they would have preferred that they did not get into this at all at a UN level. So this was, this changed over just 2003 when the summit started to 2005 when the second phase of the summit ended. So anyway, that first phase of software as digital, main digital artifact said to have ended around 2005 with the World Summit on Information Society, because around that period, internet was becoming the big thing. Now, software and internet are different things, obviously. Software resides largely or mostly on our desktops, and internet resides somewhere else, where we are the clients of cloud-based services, which started with Google, and soon we had Facebook, and later on Twitter, and they dominated a new times of networked software, which is called the internet. Internet is basically networked software. And suddenly there's a lot of changes taking place here. Here also, I quickly move on, but big issues around policy issues became net neutrality, which India also started grappling, though the regulation came much later in 2016. But the big thing was Google's of this world, who controls the internet. There was a lot of geopolitics and a lot of tug of war within India between the Ministry of External Affairs, who has this traditional North-South thinking, and they were more concerned about the geopolitics of the internet, and the Ministry of IT, which was very happy that Indian software industry, holding the apron strings of the US software industry, was doing well. So they did not want any geopolitics. There was a lot of politics between these departments. I happened to be in the middle of it, a lot of it. also, but these are markers of the history of what is happening. Uh, so 2005 to around 2014, let's say next 10 years or 9 years, we can think is the era of internet. Many things happened. There was the Indian Common Services Centers scheme, which was the main way ICT for development or e-governance was supposed to be done. I hope you would have heard of Common Service Centers. The National E-Governance Plan. So there was some restructuring of government agencies. But let's move on. In this period also, the main area industrialization wise was still software development. So India was now becoming a major software backend. So companies like TCS, which was already big, but Infosys and all now became mega companies employing lakhs of Indians who were delivering projects for their Western clients. And they become big, and they become a part of Indian thinking. That IT engineer, Bangalore, later on also Hyderabad, Chennai, Noida, and the big thing was the huge backend systems which India, backend software systems, not even backend software systems, backend service software service provider companies which India developed, and our whole effort was to support that. In between, what started to happen on a digital economy sense was that some Indian startups were saying that it's not enough that India develops backend services, just deliver projects to the Western clients, and we should have our own products. There's Indian industry association called iSplit, if you would have heard of it, which broke off from NASSCOM, which represented the old model of the way I have described software industry tied to the apron strings of the US. And iSplit talked about India having its own products and not just giving services and making products of an Oracle or a Microsoft in the US. And also, by that time, towards the later end of this phase, the 9-year phase from 2005 to 2014, we started to have software as an infrastructure services. And software as an infrastructure was provided, and we started to have software as a service companies in India, which was a big part of what was our new digital industry. There is much to talk about this phase also, but let's move on and finish the historical narrative first. Around 2014, I use that year because Snowden happened in 2014. And that was a big watershed globally. Though around that time, I think what is more important is the rise of change from internet economy to digital economy. And I'll describe what does it mean. First was the software industry, or software economy till about 2005, then 2005 to around 2014 is the internet economy, and now we have a digital economy. So 2014, the shift is more of internet economy to digital economy, but also an important global marker was Snowden. Snowden revealed what US has used the internet for, to spy even on the heads of the state, and they kind of had access to almost everybody's laptops, whoever they wanted to look at, hear, spy on, and so on. And that really broke the innocence of the internet. Now, internet was always considered to be a good thing. It was considered to be a counterpower. And some things I quickly skipped over around the 2005 to 2014 period is how internet was considered as a counterpower. That Arab Spring came on. It was thought that internet will bring democracy to the world and so on. And those dreams were quickly crashed within 2-3 years. You know how it is in Egypt, for example, now is not much different from the Mubarak era, which faced the Arab Spring uprisings. So, but that was the period when everything was right. Internet was the counterpower. It had this thing about the Silicon Valley's meme was move fast and break things, and it was a counterpower. Now, increasingly on 2014, what I'm going to say is that, and in this period, internet companies are no longer counterpowers. They are the powerful incumbents, so much so that the traditional industries are afraid of the internet companies. So while earlier it was considered good that internet was a counterpower to media and people could distribute their own media, write blogs, etc. But today, as the Australian now was talking about at the start of my lecture, The problem is that content industry is afraid of a Google and a software. The transport industry is afraid of an Uber, Google or Facebook, sorry. And transport industry is afraid of Uber. Same way, health industry, etc., are afraid of Apple Health platform, and Google is also coming up with a health platform. Same with education, etc. So what was a counter power became the powerful incumbents. Around 2014, that shift took place. But again, with the breaking of the innocence of internet, which Snowden revelations brought to us, many things change at the global level itself. That, you know, that force against US control over internet, so-called, and I don't want to go in depth about it. There could be a few lectures devoted just to that. I've been closely involved with those discussions in committees, UN committees, etc., where we worked on it. But anyway, the innocence of the internet was lost. But at the same time, 14 is also marked with 2 or 3 other things, 14 or 15. We were increasingly gone beyond just dominance of internet in the virtual sectors, which was like media largely, you know, knowledge industry. Like Google disrupted the knowledge industry, disrupted media industry. Facebook disrupted media industry. Twitter disrupted media industry. But media industry is basically a virtual industry. There's no physical product in it. So largely the dominance of digital and internet was over the virtual areas. But it started happening in 2010s itself, but around 13, 14, the dominance of internet over physical areas, like Amazon dominating e-commerce, Uber dominating transport, but also all other sectors like education, health, etc., was very clear that not only would these digital companies enter into these sectors, but they would completely dominate and uproot the existing incumbents. That was very evident. Another thing which happened around early 2010s, and I'm putting the marker at around 2014, but it happened between 2010 and 14 or 15, is the emergence of China, not just as China's earlier policies were largely oriented to control the internet as a political challenge. And that everything about them, they contested US power at the global level and so on, was to see that internet should not disrupt what they call as their political and social stability. Harmony is the word they use. So it was largely oriented to it, but the byproduct of that was that they were able to create a digital industry of their own. Many reasons supported that particular development. So there is a Chinese digital industrial policy model, which if I have time, I'll come to later. But suddenly around these years, 2000 to 2014, Alibaba's and Tencent's of this world had grand IPOs in the West. And West's eyes were opened suddenly to that China is not just internet controlling power, but it is now a rival digital power. And after 2014, coming to the present world, it is very evident that world is now becoming bipolar between US and China as two digital powers. Even EU is largely getting out of the equation. And China is fast countering AI US for even artificial intelligence supremacy, and artificial intelligence controls would be as important as control over industrial manufacturing, which happened in 19th and 20th century. And that will define the coming world. So this bipolar digital world has started to emerge, and this process started around 2014. So very quickly, I'll summarize what I said. There were 3 periods of what is called digital technologies which changed. What was the software industry, the internet industry or industrial internet economy, and now the digital economy. And digital economy is different from internet. That first around the middle of 2005 to 10, Google's and Facebook's of this world realized that it is not the networking which is the major thing that they have, but data which they gather from people, which is their main asset. And once you understand data as your main asset and not just networking is like Facebook could put millions of people together, and that's their key competitive advantage. That's their key business proposition. But outwardly, the networking is the key business proposition. But Increasingly, it was the data which they collected and the intelligence they gathered over data. You can call it artificial intelligence or data analytics. All are intelligence collected from data. We call it digital intelligence. This is a term IT for Change developed, which is used now by UNCTAD also, digital intelligence instead of artificial intelligence. I can go into why we prefer that term, but one of our major conceptual wins is that this term was introduced by IT for Change and being used by UNCTAD at present. So it shifts from internet economy to a digital economy when the centerpiece of a business is data and intelligence developed from this data. So you have a clear conceptual three-way division. First is a standalone software around till 2005 or a little earlier, maybe 2003. Then is the internet economy, which is about networked software, which is the internet, which is a huge networking effect is caused. And around 2011 to 14 onwards is the digital economy, where the central competitive advantage, the business model is around data and artificial intelligence. So there were very different phases, very different policy requirements, and things move so fast that not only academics who tend to do stable, deep researches, and not only policymakers who face problems as they come, and they come almost daily, but even business leaders, and I keep on being in touch with business leaders, do not understand what's happening really so well. I mean, every 3 years, they would have very different things to say. So we are dealing with a phenomenon which is one, moving so quickly, but we do not have a luxury to wait, analyze, and control it, because at the same time, as I described, things have changed so fast that from EU being a global industrial power, EU is getting out of the equation, and we have a bipolar digital power world in which the two poles are US and China, and EU is very, very concerned about it. I again talk to them a lot, and I will talk probably about what kind of industrial policies they have therefore tried. So this is a bit of the historical phase. Now, in the second part of my, anything which anybody would want to ask a question or something at this point, I'm very happy to again get a temperature of what people are thinking.
Are you trying to say that EU is being dislodged despite the Finnish presence, as well as the presence of those set of countries which are otherwise playing a very big role with respect to both software and hardware during the deep time period which you had said as 2005 to 11?
Yeah, as I would now just, Krishna Kumarji, come to describing what digital economy is, and then it will show that hardware and software are now relegated to much lower levels of what is a digital value chain. The top of the digital value chain is controlled by those who control platforms, and platforms as places where data is mined and transformed into artificial intelligence or data analytics, which is a primitive form of artificial intelligence. So yes, while EU still has very top class scientific achievements and prowess, in some areas quite better than China, they have good hardware work, they have good software companies, but still they are nowhere. And one of the UNCTAD's statistics is, and that will show where things are headed, that 90% of capitalization of top 70 platforms, and if you control the platform, you control the sector, and I'll come to you how that happens. Top 70 platforms of the world, 90% of its capitalization is either in US or China. So you can understand where is Europe. 90%. In industrial era, there was never anything even close to this kind of disbalance of economic power. Never, even between North and South perhaps, much less between US and Europe, and US and China on one side and the rest of the world. 90% of the top 70 platforms are owned in US and China. Right. So despite those things which you said, Krishnanji. I will now try, any other person wants to maybe raise a point or two here, helps me, direct my thoughts also towards.
Yes, sir. In fact, when you had suggested in another lecture about this digital economy report and I read it, I was really shocked to see the data of this 90% of this thing. But
Absolutely, sure.
it's very difficult to digest that suddenly that whole presence of that set of that European thing suddenly dislodges. That's why I was asking.
Yeah, so I will try to explain what happens. And this is the next 10 minutes I'll try to take. What is digital economy and how it is different from industrial economy? Actually, I don't accept this fourth uh, uh, industrial revolution. I think it's beyond industrial revolution. I think it's a complete paradigmatic jump from industrialization to digitalization. Uh, and and that is the reason you're right to how and unless and you're right unless researchers recognize, I don't say I'm fully recognizing, but our effort is to focus on what you said. How can suddenly economic power, change so much? And that's what all our efforts have been trying to figure out. And therefore, our frameworks try to look at what has changed so clearly, structurally, and to such a extreme manner to cause this shift. I mean, China, you guys may realize that around 2005, Indian IT prowess was much better than Chinese. China was nowhere. Nobody thought software is something China can do. And today they are digital giants, which they are uh, close on heels of the US. 10 years is just nothing. I mean, 15 years even, but they changed in 10 years from being worse off in software than India to being top of artificial intelligence and what matters for industrial strength, as we are not techies, but we deal with economics and industrial policies. Uh, and so now trying to come back to what has happened. So I go back to the very basics to try to understand, and this I should have would have mentioned in my last lecture also, because that's where I try to understand what was industrialization, and I would have used that example at that time, but I quickly repeat it because the participants are new. If you really look back and say what was that which happened in the late 18th century in UK, which is called industrialization, then you realize that there was a sudden jump in civilizational capacities and therefore productivity. And what does that jump is also less I mean, you need a bigger word to describe what happened. But what happened was that mechanical power was kind of controlled in a new manner by the society. The first time mechanical power used to exist either in human beings who used their hands to do work, or animals who were plowing the fields, or doing some basic work, pulling horse carriages for transportation and everything. All mechanical energy was either in physically in human beings or in animals. And the first time we were able to automate mechanical energy, and the machine was born, a powered machine. It was earlier first powered by force of water, then steam and electricity. And these are the phases of industrial revolution. But what happened was that first time we were able to get the physical power out of human beings and animals into machines. And that transfer represents industrialization. And once industrialization took place, everything changed. The nature of family changed from the old kinship based family structure to the nuclear family because of the needs of the workforce. The nature of nation state changed, nature of international relationships changed, colonization took place as a new phenomenon. We know how much India contributed to GDP around that time, and suddenly, just in a few years, Manchester was making 80% of world's textiles, which was largely made in Dhaka before that, and all that happened within very few decades because there was a sudden jump which took place. And let's try to understand digitalization also a similar jump, and not as a fourth phase of industrialization. I can understand from steam to coal power, to oil power, to electricity. They are phases of industrialization, but this is not a phase of industrialization as we know. This is not the fourth industrial revolution. This is digital revolution. What happens in the digital revolution is that first time, even when massive industrial systems are organized, the intelligence still is within human beings or within organizations, which are systems of human beings. So the intelligence was always within human beings, which worked on mechanical power, and we produced the products of industrial society. First time what is happening is that intelligence is getting disembodied from human beings into machines. which is the similar jump as mechanical energy or mechanical power change from human and physical animals and human beings to machines. This change, where now machines are automatically taking and running large scale systems. I mean, Uber and Amazon runs large scale systems without any human intervention. You go to a Amazon website, what is presented to you, even prices may be fixed for you, deliveries may be decided, everything is done without any human intervention at all. That's a big change. And if you propagate the change across the society, the least we can say that things will change as much as it changed with industrialization over the late 18th century. I dare say things will change much more, because intelligence as a productive factor is perhaps even vast and has a far-reaching implication than mechanical power. So coming to your question, Krishna Kumarji, is that what is happening is, so software and internet were only the building blocks of what is the capture of data and intelligence power. So you need software, first of all. Without that software, you can't have an internet. And without an internet, you cannot have a platform. But once a platform is made, it is not simply, and largely people still see platforms as a interconnecting system. Uber is a system which interconnects drivers and commuters. No, it is much more. And I'll tell you what it is. And if we not understand, is platform a networking device or an intelligent system? Between the two lies the real jump. Rest of it is a gradual growth from software to internet being a networking system and platform being a networking system. But what a platform today, Uber, is an embodiment of transportation intelligence. It collects data from everybody. And that's what, if I ask you people here, the attendance question, right now, out of the top 8 companies of the world by market capitalization, 7 are digital companies who have a data-based model. That is, 8th one is Tesla, which also actually is digital. But even if you remove Tesla, 7 are companies which have a data-based model. Now, just 10 years back, the top 8 or 10 companies were largely oil companies, which are industrial giants. And again, it comes back to what we were discussing. How can such a quick shift of economic power take place? And we simply do not still understand that shift. How would be able to confront that challenge and have our digital industrialization policy is the main substance of what I'm trying to discuss with you. So what a platform today, and if I ask you, if Uber is a big company today, or Amazon is the biggest, richest company today, I mean, not the richest company, it is among the richest companies, but the owner of Amazon is the richest person. What is it that Amazon owns, which makes it rich? I know we always knew that what makes an Exxon rich, because it owns the oil fields. We know what made GE rich, because it owned industrial machinery designs and production. What is it that Uber and Amazon owns, which makes them the world's biggest companies? Can you tell me, what is that one thing which they control or own? And it's an open question just to get the audience involved. If anybody would want to take a go at what is it? I mean, after all, the biggest company in the world would have to have a product, to have a service, central business proposition. What is it? Anybody? We are not allocating marks, so you can just stand up and take a guess.
It's a platform.
Yes.
It's the data.
Yeah, it's between the two, Ramaji and Krishnaji. You are right. Anybody else you want to say what is it?
I think with the data, they also can have an impact on say your choice or your opinion. What Facebook is also doing, something like that.
Absolutely. Actually, you are all saying the right things, but we are just to tie it up conceptually. All three things are actually perfect: platform, data, and their control over our decisions or influencing our decisions or knowing about our decisions.
It's nudging and choice architecture.
But what does it come from? The choice, how can you nudge me? If you try to nudge me, I would not get nudged. What is it that makes me able to nudge you? That's the real thing they have. What is that?
And they are doing a commercialization of data, private data. That's called surveillance capitalism.
Yes, but what is that thing which they have and you don't have, or Indian company does not have? One thing which they have. You are saying the impacts of the thing they have, but what is it that they have? How are they able to nudge you? How are they able to control your behavior? How are they able to predict your behavior? How does somebody predict something? It's called
Big data.
intelligence.
analytics.
Yeah.
Constantly.
Constantly what?
They're constantly influencing our mind, they're in constant touch with us, not losing the gap is not there.
Yeah,
Constant monitoring is there, influencing our minds.
how do we influence a matter? Can I influence your mind? What would I need for just that? I mean, you don't get influenced by your own organization, your friend who's saying something. No, what allows them to influence your mind? The fact that they influence their mind is forever. We know advertising agency has been trying to influence your mind for the last 50 years. That is a big business. Influencing your mind is what advertising agency does for last 50 years. They have made money, but that's not what a digital economy is. What allows them to influence that your mind in such a decisive and controlling manner is the point. So I've taken all the points, but they all point to what I'm trying to say. They have intelligence about you. They have intelligence about who you are, what you do, what your kids do what your spouses do, what people like you do, not only you. And we still think about personal intelligence. Now, personal intelligence is a small part of what they know about you. They know about people like you. They know about people in such and such age gap, who are of such gender, who like books. They would probably like these kind of genes. Now that is very absurd, but actually connections were made between certain kind of genes and voting behavior in the US, whether you'll vote Democratic and or Republican. It's as absurd as that, but human beings are animals of patterns of behavior. And these guys know patterns of behavior. They have immense intelligence that if you're looking for this product, this is the product that is going to catch your attention, because they have seen millions of other people doing the same thing. So
Like just to intervene, I think there is also a documentary like on such thing called Social Behavior, Social Dilemma by on Netflix that is available. They're also showing how digital these platforms are actually manipulating and collecting all the data and everything.
yeah, that's largely still about, no, I'm not disagreeing. Personal behavior. There's a lot of talk about personal behavior, but we have worked, I mean, I'm working with the government of India on non-personal data architecture right now with Chris Gopalakrishnan committee. Non-personal data is even more group behavior. The behavior of people like you is as invasive as what Social Dilemma shows. And Social Dilemma, what it shows is shocking enough. And it's not good enough for us to be shocked at a personal level. That's what Social Dilemma achieves. We need to be shocked at a society economy level at what our economic futures are. So those kind of shocks have to be developed into real frameworks of economics and then change into policies. So while I'm quite impressed with the kind of influence those movies make, but the point is, what is therefore an economic framework of what's happening? And those are evading us. As you as economic researchers and social researchers need to understand, it's good enough. We have been hearing about these shocks since Snowden. The kind of thing Snowden talked, I still can't believe as a researcher in this area yet. So while those shocks are important, what is the economic framework of what's happening? What is the question which Krishna Kumarji asked about? How can 70 top digital platforms be owned 90% by two countries? And what does a platform mean? So again, coming to all what you have said, yes, it's a platform, but the question is platforms real value proposition and networking power? A platform like Facebook has a networking power because everybody is on a Facebook and therefore everybody else wants to be on Facebook. The networking effect. Is that their value proposition? That was their value proposition in the period from 2005 to 2015, which I described as the internet economy. Internet economy was about networking, but digital economy is beyond networking. You need networking for being a data and AI superpower. In the same way, we need software, the old thing of IT we know, to be on the internet. So you need a computer, laptop, and Microsoft basic things to go onto the internet. So software power is needed for internet power, but on the top of it is data and digital intelligence power. And the main thing an Uber or Amazon owns today, or a Twitter or Facebook owns today, is intelligence about the sector. The earlier companies used to own the mechanical power of the sector. These companies own intelligence of the sector. Now, this is a slightly not an easy mental transition to make, but you need to make it, because without understanding intelligence as being the central economic factor, people have called it a factor of production even, and how it comes to top the value chains. You still study that earlier the global value chains were headed by industrial companies, which will produce goods in the UK, take raw materials from India and produce the finished goods back, and that's called colonization. Later on, IP companies outsourced. IP ownership was what made you had the value chain. Manufacturing was outsourced. This is what you hear. But what I'm trying to say is, and we need to be as clear about it. While the statistics clearly say that data owning and AI companies have become top of the chart globally, our economic models don't understand that. And I will share my writings with you, in which we clearly say that IP ownership has been superseded in all sectors by data and digital intelligence ownership. And in a value chain, the top company in any sector is which owns the platform, yes, but in owning that platform, their main asset is to own data, which is transformed into digital intelligence. So you now have a new digital colonial extractive chain, whereby data is taken from developing countries. It was taken to developed countries, actually not developed countries, to China or to the US, where it is transformed into digital intelligence. And that intelligence is then used to provide digitally intelligent services to you. Uber is a very simple thing. You want to go to the airport, you call for Uber. Uber is not a transportation service. It is a digitally intelligent transport service. The digitally intelligent part is what differentiates it from the earlier thing, which you had to one day in advance call a taxi guy who you were not sure will arrive at 5 o'clock and then negotiate money with him. Digitally intelligent transportation, digitally intelligent education, digitally intelligent agriculture. By the way, a lot of problems, issues around the farm laws have also to do with what is going to be digitalization behind them. And I wouldn't get into it, it needs a completely different lecture, but including manufacturing is going to be digitalized and platformized. So platformization is one layer, but you have to understand it as ownership of data and intelligence. So this is the main thing. You know, I don't know, Waymo is the Google's sister company, which develops automobile intelligence. Have you heard of Waymo? Waymo
No,
is, you
no.
have heard about it?
No, we have not heard of it.
Okay, Waymo is Alphabet, you know, is that the mother company of Google, and that's the business restructuring they did a few years back. And Waymo, WAYMO, is the automobile company of Google. You can consider it as the automobile company of Google. That's the easier way to understand it. In 10 years, it is being said that Waymo, which simply develops driving intelligence, will be bigger than Tesla, GM, Toyota, I don't know, 5 top companies. I forgot the 5 top automobile companies. Waymo will be bigger than 5 top automobile companies. This is a statistics from Economist, I think. I have a reference to it in my paper. I can share it with you. Now, Waymo company, which we do not even know what it does, is going to be the top automobile companies in 10 years. And not only the top automobile company, it's going to be bigger than the next big 5 of today. Have you come across an economic framework which captures what is happening here? And that's a question I was discussing with you. Why don't we have an economic framework which captures what is happening? We are shocked, we are challenged, we are sometimes find it fantastic that this is happening. Whatever, we may have an emotion, but it's not about emotions, it's about having a research, academic and conceptual framework about what is happening. Why would Waymo become bigger than the top automobile companies of today and be bigger than 5 of them in 10 years? Now, if you ask what does Waymo does, it says we don't make automobiles, we make drivers. That's very funny. What is a driver? They make autonomous drivers. They are not replacing the vehicle, they're replacing you as a driver. And that's where I was earlier saying in a conceptual manner that like industrialization replaced mechanical power a horse carriage was pulled by a horse, but now a car is pulled by a combustion engine. In the same manner, Waymo is removing the driver out and putting its autonomous software. It actually does not make the cars. Jaguar makes cars for it, and it allows other people to make the cars. What it puts in it is the brain of the car. The brain is owned by Waymo or Google, and that's what drives the automobile sector today. There's no economic framework which tells us how this shift from control over mechanical power to control over intelligence power is what is driving the new value chains and new digital economy. And everything about digital economy is understanding that. And that the brain analogy is again used a lot by me and my organization. Uber is nothing but the brain of the transportation sector. Amazon is not so much about the goods it makes, that's an extra profit. Amazon is brain of shopping. So you have now trying to capture the brain of social systems. And today, the brains of our social systems is either in the US or in the China. And if this kind of dependence keeps on growing, I can assure you, it's not a rhetoric, it will be much worse than the dependency of the industrial sector, which your ISID and your researchers all research. But we do not have a framework of what macroeconomics is this, not even macroeconomics, what economic framework is this? And we need to get that framework. Again, I'll share some papers with you. Okay, now I'm left with not much time. You would really want to know then what should be done. I mean, I have described what's happening and what is the problem. I'll take very little time before I go down to the questions, but I'll try to describe what can be done. And things can still be done. But we have a very small time window. Why? Because intelligence-based dependency is such a thing that once you get into that, it's very difficult to detach. Now, we may be using, say, we use Mercedes cars for a long time. We can suddenly say we will not import cars from Mercedes. Now, it's a very painful decision, but it's not that painful. You can still start making your own cars and say, we'll not take it from Mercedes. I mean, maybe we did it in 1970s or 80s. We took that kind of a decision. You can therefore cut the industrial dependency chains much more easier than intelligence-based dependency chains, because the time will come, and it will come very soon, that all your decisions, and you know already how much you are addicted to your Google or your WhatsApp, or increasingly to Amazon, because Amazon really seem to know what you want very quickly. What needs to take half a day to buy, choose, and get delivered can be done within hours today, or within minutes, excluding the delivery, which also happened within 24 hours. Or Uber, Uber knows what you want, where do you go often, I mean, those kind of things. So increasingly, these intelligence systems will take over your kitchen behavior. When you go for 15 days for vacation, you come back, Amazon already knows the kind of buys you do, and they're already suggesting that why don't you buy these things, because that's the typical groceries you get. And you find it so convenient that you get hooked onto it. Even your salon appointments, go to a hairdresser, etc., everything will get encapsulated into an intelligent system. What I'm trying to say, that dependencies which grow and solidifies in an intelligence-based system are such that once they are formed, it's very difficult to cut those dependency cords. As we could have suddenly said, we will not import Mercedes cars. You will not say we will not import the outsourced intelligence, which increasingly we are getting used to, whether it is our health systems, education systems, transportation, and increasingly it will be manufacturing, agriculture, you name the sector. The intelligence or the brain is in the US, the work is getting done here. It's like a physical body and the brain. Beyond a point, the physical body will not be able to work, because every intelligence about how you work, who needs what, when, who produces what are the production capacities, what are the limitations, what are the logistics, everything is controlled by a brain somewhere there. So these dependencies are going to be very extreme. So we need to move very quickly. So I now quickly will try to say what could be digital industrial policies and what kind of higher level policy imperatives exist here. The digital industrial policies have this first layer, which we have already done well, which are enabling frameworks. The IT Act of India provides those enabling frameworks. For example, digital payment is a legal way to pay, digital signatures is a legal way to sign contracts, etc. What is been done by IT Act and other acts which provide the enabling framework. But that enabling framework only promotes a Silicon Valley model of single global economy with brains in one pole or at the most two poles, and an undifferentiated global data and global AI space, which is not cut along territorial boundaries as much of industrial economy is. So the first imperative is to take back control, we'll have to cut back some of that global digital space along territorial boundaries, because along territorial boundaries alone can we exercise certain kind of controls. You people would have heard a lot perhaps about the problems India is facing at the WTO with e-commerce negotiations, where they want the doctrine of free flow of data. Have you heard of free flow of data doctrine? I mean, or free flow of data as a concept at global?
No.
Okay, so basically the US says that, you know, data is such a good thing, it should be allowed to be allowed to flow freely to across all countries, and they're in a hurry to get all countries to sign on international trade agreements where this is made as an irrevocable commitment. India has been resisting, but most developing countries have not been able to resist, and they have, you know, kind of jumped the wagon, but still many developing countries are still resisting. Now, this is a very nice way of saying free flow of data basically means that whoever takes up data controls it. If Google has extracted data from our schools, which that Google Scholar and Google education platforms do, which are being used by many schools, whoever collects data is theirs. Now, it didn't used to happen with oil or minerals, right? Just because you take out oil, the oil is not yours unless the society or the nation from which you took oil gave you the permission and took certain royalties. But doesn't happen in data. And we were earlier talking about that data has become the single most important resource, because it is data which converts into intelligence. And intelligence, as we were talking, is something which puts you on the top of the value chains. If you own the intelligence of the sector, you're at the top of a value chain, but you own the intelligence if you have mines which get you data. And what is a data mine? A platform is a data mine. Amazon is a data mine because you daily leave your digital footprints as you shop on Amazon. And these digital footprints are data which keeps on increasing its intelligence. That intelligence makes you come back again and again, because the value proposition keeps on increasing, because they are now more intelligent about what kind of things you buy, and you really love it. I love it when I can order a thing within a few seconds, which keeps on increasing their intelligence. And that becomes an unsustainable shift of power from those who own intelligence and those whom intelligence is about, which is the communities and societies, which are at the other end of the data and the artificial intelligence extractive chain. So what is needed is, so the free flow of data basically means it's a political economy doctrine. They will call it not a political economy doctrine. This is a facilitating doctrine for the digital economy to work. That's what they call, but it actually means that whoever collects data owns it. But we have attempted counter policy propositions that whose data it is should own the data. If data is about me, I should own the data. And there are some personal data frameworks which exist, but India is going beyond. And this is the work IT for Change has done. Sorry. And also the data committee of government, which is now coming up with its final recommendation. Its draft recommendation is already out, which says that communities own the data when data is about them. That completely can shift the power. And the communities, when they become the owner, they can license companies. For example, the community of commuters in Delhi own the transportation data about Delhi. Though Uber may collect the data, the data may reside with Uber, but legal and economic rights are with the community. Now, once you make this initial first principles, then you start inverting the single digital economy model, which comes from Silicon Valley, has been copied by China. And we start to develop more domestic industrial models. These are the first principles. Now, how these first principles convert into actual digital policy prescriptions, I will tell if I have time. But the first principle was, and this has been established by this committee, that a community owns its data. The farmers own the data, which drones may be flying over, Karnataka and taking pictures and the crop photographs and soil photographs, on which they are developing many kinds of intelligence about the nutrition value of that soil or the crop kinds which produce certain harvests, etc. Now that intelligence is owned by the agriculture company which takes those photographs, but the new rule says that the data is, even if it is existing with the agriculture company, the economic rights are with those whose data it is, which is the farmers whose fields it is. So now this principle starts changing the equation. Now, what this particular committee says is that therefore, Indian communities have a right to tell Uber that please give this data to us back. We'll develop what we call as data infrastructures. Now, the role of the public sector in the industrial economy was to develop infrastructures on the top of which industrialization was possible. Unless roads, bridges, ports, banks, these kind of infrastructures were developed, industrialization can't take place. So this was a public sector role, and the question of the role of public sector also came up, and the top of which the private businesses flourished. In the same way, there are certain responsibilities of a digital state for a digital economy. One of them is to develop data infrastructures. So while we were talking about data as the most important thing, so I'll just stick to that. So take data from all these companies, develop common data infrastructure, which is made available to Indian industry to develop their own competing product. And that is the only way to break the global monopolies which come from either US and China. So this is the single biggest important point of inversion of the existing global digital economy model, which we are trying to do. And that report is ready. And again, the draft report is already in public domain, and you can look at it. That would require many other things to be done. But this point of communities owning the economic rights over the data as a principle is very important. And on the top of it, therefore, we can have our own transportation companies, own intelligent education companies, own intelligent agriculture companies. And not only we want to have our own companies, but we don't want to have a single Indian monopoly as well. I mean, one can name Reliance as a competitor to Amazon, but the whole point is not that Amazon goes and Reliance becomes a single e-commerce entity in India. We want to have a distributed economic power system where enough number of competitive digital businesses can feed off common data, and that common data would be made available by government as data infrastructure. And this is the kind of model. So you may already be starting to get an idea of what a new kind of digital economy model is possible. Some people were talking, I mean, Krishna Kumarji talked about Europe. Europe is also very disturbed about what's happening. They have recently come up with the Data Governance Act. They have also come up with the Digital Markets Act, and they have come up with various kinds of data, various kind of economic regulations around data. For example, they say that the traders who put their goods on Amazon own the data about those goods, and they can both individually and collectively get back that data. Those getting back that data has huge amount of new kind of possibilities of a new business model where the traders are almost co-owning the platform, because whoever controls data controls economic decisions. I know those kind of, I mean, just quickly touching upon, again, I have done a paper which compares the Indian data governance model, which I described to you, with this new European efforts at controlling their own data. European industrial policy, digital industrial policy, they don't use the word industrial policy because it's not so fashionable nowadays. But what they do can be subsumed under a digital policy framework, has also cloud computing elements. They have sector-wise approach. They're developing sector-wise platforms in areas like logistics and health. These are the two sectors. They've already developed certain kind of interoperability platforms, which can be done by the public sector, or it is done by cooperatives of actors in that area. For example, it's trying to getting automobile manufacturers to pool together their data systems and feed off them rather than being dependent on mobility platforms. These are called automated mobility platforms of either US or China. So these kinds of shifts are taking place. I still have 15 minutes to go. I'll stop here. There are many things I can keep on sharing, but I like to now engage with questions. I've given a very broader view. I've given you my biggest part, and which I took most of the hour, was to try to say that we need economic models which actually capture what is happening. The time of us to be surprised by what is happening is long gone or fast going out. We need economic models which understand what's happening and how who tops the global value chains. What is it to be a digital intelligence power or a data power? What does it mean? And once you understand it from a Southern conception, not what the Silicon Valley gives. It's a very different view from a Southern conception. Those kind of works I would like economic scholars and other social science scholars to do. And once you capture what is happening, then to develop a whole system of digital industrial policies. How can we own and control our own intelligence within different sectors? And I'm not asking for an insular approach that India should become some kind of insular digital economy. We should connect to a global digital economy, but on our own terms, like the way we wanted to do in the industrial digital economy. So have enough intelligence control which are within the country, and while technologies should flow freely. I mean, US tries to confuse the matters when say that data should flow freely, and we think, yes, as digital society or digital economies, global things should flow freely. While technologies should flow freely, data and intelligence should be owned locally. Now, that's the very two different layers of what actually is happening. And therefore, we have to separate our understanding of what is a software layer, what is the internet layer, what is the data and digital intelligence layer of this whole system of what is called digital economy, what kind of policies we have for each layer, what kind of global distribution we can have or global dependence we can have on a lower layer, but try not to have it on a higher layer, which is the intelligence layer, how intelligence can be more localized, and how we can have a hybrid model without becoming insular of digital economy where we can prosper. So I will take some questions and then maybe say a few points in pursuance of answering those questions.